Hello, I'm John Pinder. I've been asked to give a presentation here for the webinar organised by the Albufera Life Plus programme. And in particular, I've been asked to sort of give a presentation about my experiences with creating and managing partnerships. I've been working in the water industry for over 40 years now, and latterly I've been working with lake protection and restoration, and with that the whole of the lake watersheds or catchments. And it's in that context that here in the UK we've had some serious problems and have had some significant results through good science and good scientific knowledge, and then putting that into the context of how do we actually use that information for restoring various environments, and in this case lakes and wetlands. So if I can just switch now to the PowerPoint, let's go through some of my sort of thoughts. So I started off by working on two of the lakes in the Lake District National Park in the northwest of England. And in particular, I sort of look back to really the late 1970s when I first came to the area, and was struck by the fact that the water quality criteria for the rivers running into Lake Windermere and out of Lake Windermere were both classed as of good standard. And there was a line drawn through the lake that sort of inferred that the lake was in good condition as well. It had no objectives and no standards. That wasn't part of the system. And there was an assumption that lakes were also of good standard. In reality, that wasn't the case, and we found that the criteria that we now understand about lakes were not the same as for river water quality. And in fact, those lakes were deteriorating. We have quite deep lakes in the Lake District National Park, and although the conditions were not ideal, they weren't nearly as bad as some other lakes within the UK that were shallow lakes and associated wetlands. And they were even more stressed. When we look at the public activities that come to the Lake District, we find that there's over 20 million visitor days a year. So a very important area for the local community, but even more so for the visiting public. So effectively, with no protective strategy, and therefore there was no driver for any actions. Worse than that, the legislation could not actually determine that the lakes were being compromised or indeed were polluted. So although the legislation covered rivers and streams very well, they didn't satisfy our needs for lake protection. More recently, of course, we're all familiar with the Water Framework Directive and ecosystem services, two familiar concepts that are now widely used across Europe. And the legislation for the first time brings water quality criteria for lake protection into the forefront. And that's an extremely useful part of the armoury. But it gets more complex than those early standards for streams and rivers. And now we have not only water quality chemical standards, but nature and conservation requirements, and we use lakes and rivers for a variety of different functions, not least of which we have flood prevention and a whole range of human activities that are considered as legitimate uses, and each requiring their own sorts of standards to ensure that those progress well. So we have multiple objectives now, and the lake and wetland world has become much more complex. So how do we actually resolve the issues and set the standards? Who can do what? Well, of course, the government agencies historically and now have got some interest in the amenity values, certainly at local government level. And at central government level, we have obviously the legislative mechanisms and the drivers there. But the other functions and the values and the objectives that don't come under sort of central or even regional local government are found in non-government organisations and local groups. And this table is really an example. It certainly isn't comprehensive. And certainly the values and objectives can be expanded, and so too can the number of organisations. I've really just indicated here that there are different sorts of organisations at different levels, from very, very local or individual right up to central government. It gets more complex when we look at how we actually put partnerships together. And probably all of us are familiar with the three-cornered arrangement between the environment, economy and community, all of which need to be in balance. But I've drawn here from the area of social science about how do we actually get those three functions to work together. They are different, and they have different objectives and for different purposes, all of which are legitimate. And it comes to the question of exchanges. So here's a model from the world of social science about exchange models, and you can see that there's to actually get a deal between two different factions, you need to have an exchange. So for instance, the one between the environment and the community gives protection and improvement to the environment by active involvement of local people, and the environment gives to the community, because of that work, quality of life. That in itself is quite a complex exercise, but it goes beyond that. So the economy, environment, and the community or population is one sort of model, and it can actually be expanded to further down the scale to administrations, NGOs and community groups where there is exchanges. And those exchanges have to be accepted and adopted by all of those people who are doing the negotiation. Otherwise, they're not going to become involved. And it's the very core of partnership creation, is to recognize that there has to be an exchange and actually to put a value on that exchange. And if that wasn't complicated enough, then it's not just a three-cornered arrangement. We have industries, NGOs, administrations at different levels, and different organisations such as local environment groups, private companies and landowners. So the whole network becomes very complex. But whilst it might be complex, these groups are needed because each plays a part. I've likened it to a jigsaw, where each piece of the jigsaw plays a particular part, and each has its own small picture, but you really don't see the whole picture, or unless all of those pieces are in place and all are actually interacting and fit in well with each other. So I think the jigsaw is quite a useful analogy in how partnerships should hang together to actually provide and produce what's required in the bigger picture. One of the first things we did at Windermere, and also at another lake called Bassenthwaite Lake, was to try to decide what was a common basis that we could all start working to. And we decided that a vision or a mission statement or was a statement that we required, which we could all subscribe to, whatever the language for our particular organisation. And it needed to be short, it needed to be fairly strong, and it needed to be relevant. And it also needed to recognise that there may well be some partners that haven't yet joined, but it will be relevant to them. The second thing that we decided was that it needed to be meaningful to people served by those partner organisations. So organisations such as local councils or even NGOs are doing specific work, but usually they're doing it on behalf of some sector of the community or local people. And therefore it needs to be meaningful in lay language. The third point that we realised was that at the onset, none of the organisations that became partners really knew what those other organisations were about or what their objectives were. And it became important for us to realise that we could not negotiate an agreement, that exchange of ideas, and an exchange to be part of a partnership, unless we actually understood fully what the partner's business position and priorities are. And then we subsequently decided that timescales need to reflect on the task to be undertaken. These may be very short-term things, such as projects that actually achieve a particular piece of the program that needs to be attained, or it may be long-term, and sometimes the restoration of environments such as wetlands and lakes really need the long-term, and certainly a longer term than the political arena allows, or the between elections of whatever the organisation is. So timescales need to reflect that this may be longer than some of the comfortable position that some organisations can work to. And we needed to also to explain to the public what's needed and when it will be delivered. So common language for all partners and for the public to understand. And so eventually we came out, albeit it took quite a long time, for our mission statement or vision for Windermere. So here we have a healthy Windermere catchment for now, forever. A healthy, because that could be described in different terms depending on the organisation. Catchment came into it because there was a need to explain to people the relevance of catchments and the fact that the protection of the lake needed to recognise the protection of the whole watershed. And then for now and forever, it was to recognise that this wasn't a quick fix, such as the installation of a new wastewater treatment plant. A lot of it was about changing behaviour of each and every one of us, and that this was requiring a cultural shift in the way that we operate, behave, and look after our own watershed. So it became quite complex philosophically, even though it was a short statement. Now, that's setting up the partnerships, or at least the framework of doing so. But actually keeping it going is another challenge. And here are a few of the things that we decided that were required to keep our partnerships going. First, to recognise that you have a number of short-term projects within a long-term programme. And the programme hasn't got a finite end. It's more of a journey rather than something with a definite finish point. There's a need to acknowledge partners, whether they're there for the long term or whether they just play a short part in the job that's to be done. Referring back to my analogy of pieces of a jigsaw, but they need to be acknowledged in the public place so that maintains kudos and reputation of that organisation for being a part of the partnership. And another aspect was the attempting to demonstrate gearing in what was offered. A lot of time and effort that was put in by volunteers and by organisations who contributed staff time could be translated into monetary terms. And so in-kind contribution could be put in monetary terms, so that each organisation could go back to its corporate body to identify that for every euro that they contributed, either as real money or as in-kind contribution, may be contributed to 20 times that amount being delivered by other organisations for that bigger job that was being done. And so gearing as an argument for investment of one organisation by quantifying what the other partners were contributing was a valuable way of demonstrating that it was a good idea to be a partner and to continue partnership for the value of the investment that was given. And then to celebrate achievements, we found that by using a variety and a developing range of methods to demonstrate achievements that were happening along the line, encourage future engagement. Quite often, environments such as wetlands cannot be restored overnight, and therefore either small developments or small improvements or significant changes should all be celebrated in terms of their contribution to the whole programme. We then decided that we need to maximise the roles of local action and stewardship, because in the long term, government bodies, whether it's at central government or local government, are pulled in many directions for limited resources. And although there may be a commitment for funding in the initial stages of a particular programme, the likelihood is that commitment and funding will not be there forever. And therefore there was a need for progressive transition from the lead action to go from the government type bodies down to local stewardship. And with that, it was necessary to recognise that the engagement of local people would only come through strong, energetic and dynamic leaders. And whilst those might be available and are often there at the onset to generate the programme initially, where a programme has got to be for the longer term, there's a need to nurture future leaders. And probably the best route to do that is through education and to engage with schools and colleges and universities throughout the duration, as not only partners, but through being partners to generate the leaders of the future. They will become the politicians, the farmers, the foresters, the local mayors, and so on. So traditionally, we've had a historic linear route where an initiative has come from government, whether it's central government, regional or local. They provided policy and the law and the money to do these programmes. They've appointed a delivery body by way of a contract. There may be some public awareness, and then eventually there is a delivery. This is very efficient and it's very clear, particularly for government level, whatever level that is. that they can see an investment, and they actually get a product at the end of the day once that delivery has been made. But that's, as I said before, can be short term, and the continuity of engagement at that level is always going to be tenuous because of the various directions that government bodies are pulled for finite funding that they have. So it's right and proper that the government at every level have to see where their money is best placed, and sometimes the priorities have to go somewhere other than perhaps the projects that have been started and supported for some time, but could no longer be supported financially forever. And this is where really the new way of thinking comes, and it's very different from that historic approach that was taken. Governments still, of course, have that important role, and still have policy, and still have some funding responsibility or a desire to be actually engaged. But there's now many more organisations who can be actively involved and who may wish to be involved, and that sort of goes back to the model that I showed early on. There's this exchange, the exchange between benefits and contribution. So the future for many of these environments, wetland and lake, particularly from my experience, and their associated watersheds, are all about using the new model of partnerships to take down, to move the levels of responsibility or stewardship from being purely at the legal or formal policy level, right down to water company, locals, industries, environmental businesses, and sponsors and NGOs, and so on. So I'll leave you with a picture here of a crannog. This was reconstructed from Neolithic times, and they produced flood protection, food, water resources, shelters, and so on. A whole range of things, which of course we now call ecosystem services. So the whole idea of looking at lakes and wetlands in a holistic way is not brand new, and purely on the back of the Water Framework Directive. This goes back to at least Neolithic times in Europe, and man then recognised the value of looking at these important resources in a holistic way, and also because their homesteads were actually in the lakes themselves, were acutely aware of how they needed to operate to secure their futures. And the last point is probably the most important of all, their well-being. Hope that has helped sort of give some of my views about partnership creation. Thanks very much.